Right. So, unit F foraging, I've sort of rearranged some of the next units to squeeze some a little tighter, combine them. I then created, so basically, created a new unit focused on just on social foraging. That's unit G. And so both the perusal assignments for this unit and unit G are up there. Now that I've kind of got these things restructured, I'll get UCEF out as soon as I can, and then of course give you at least a week of availability for that. And then likewise when Unit G comes out. The group project, so the not this Friday, but next Friday is when your selected organism is due. Not expecting that much. Question? Well, I mean, I think you can always shoot your ideas to me or Anushka, but pretty much as long as it's not a captive animal, as long as it's not a pet or a zoo animal, if it is an animal that, I mean, the thing is, you don't know if there's anthropogenic effects. You're just actually proposing a experiment to test for that. Yeah. Well, the idea is, again, it's like motivated by this chapter that we're not going to cover, the chapter 15, which is about the intersection of con bio and animal behavior. And so the thought is to say that if you are interested in potential anthropogenic changes to some aspect of behavior, and I hope you've seen at this point, the behavior is broad, that it may not be, it may be a developmental change. It may be something that potentially has evolutionary consequences if it's maintained that way for enough generations, and so on and so forth. It could be mechanistic, it could be functional. So, the idea is that you say, I've noticed that there are these birds, these lizards, these ground squirrels that are always hanging out in this area where they have potential contact to some human infrastructure or humans. I see your question. And then that and I don't know if that's having any effect on them, but it seems to me like there's potential. So then you would pose a question, a causal question. And so in your final presentation, I mean, this gets a little pedantic. This isn't necessarily what you do in a pitch, but I want you to make it clear that you know what type of causal question it is. And then from there, you would say, so you'd motivate the problem. You'd say, I notice there are these ground squirrels running around restaurants like Gertrude's at the Botanical Garden, and they're collecting a bunch of this waste food that has been dropped on the ground. And I am now interested in how that might affect these ground squirrels. So I could formulate a causal question about the availability of this food, about these sort of G by E interactions with the availability of this food that would lead me to then come up with potential answers to that. So hypotheses that I could then test. And then I would propose an experiment that would try to test one or more of those hypotheses, and then I would come up with the predictions that it said, okay, if we were to pay you to run that experiment, what would you predict under these hypotheses? What would that tell you relative to the question that you asked so far? And then you kind of would, and then that's sort of it. So you're sort of motivating to someone that I think there potentially could be this interaction going on. I don't have the resources to run this experiment right now, but I think it could be valuable. And so I'm just trying to motivate someone to give me resources to build this experiment so that I can run it and find out this thing. And you might, if you were to run the experiment, you might find out that there's absolutely no change, but it's just asking the question and running the experiment to test that is kind of the important thing. So at a pedagogical, perspective, the function of this is to help you, for one, look for behavior, two, formulate causal questions, and then go through the process of formulating hypotheses, designing basic outlines for experiments, and then coming up with predictions that link to all of that. Like pedagogically, that's what I want to get out of this. But then I'm hoping that on top of that, it also then allows for you to investigate angles of con bio and animal behavior overlap that I won't go into directly as much in the lecture material. So, all right. Did that answer any of your questions, or are you done? Okay. Yeah, something along. Yeah, I'm not looking for. I'm really just looking for you to observe. Like, huh? I just noticed that there happens to be a lot of a particular organism collecting in an area that is definitely has contact with humans or the products of humans, and I'm interested in that. What possibly could that be doing? Might what implications might that have on that population for long periods of time? As examples, there are some, or how did it get that way? Like someone might notice black widows, for example. They are relatively easy to find in the city. If you haven't found them, you just probably haven't looked for them because there are certain spots of the city where if you look down at night, because they only come out at night, but during the day they have this really kind of snappy web, and if you kind of if you break the web, you can hear it crackle, and they're just everywhere. They're just very easy to find black widows. If you then go out into the desert, it's very hard to find black widows. This is one of these weird urban ecology effects that no one completely understands. There's somebody like Chad Johnson here at ASU who studies these sorts of effects, trying to understand why are black widows so much more frequent in the city than in their natural habitat. And there's a bunch of animals that are like that. And so, just proposing one hypothesis to that would be something interesting. Like, how might I build an experiment to sort of see, like, maybe black widows like the heat of the city at night. Maybe black widows like that there's so many other critters that they can catch, at night, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe it has something to do with the light at night. They really like that the fact that it's so bright there. And for some reason, they like these intermediate light, at night or whatever. You can imagine a bunch of different hypotheses that you could use to study like why there is this difference. So that is an interesting observation that, wow, there are way more black widows in the city than outside. So I'm going to start that. I'm going to form a causal question based on that novel observation, and then unroll that through the whole process to say, I would like to try to answer this question if you would just fund me to do so. So, any other questions about that? I'm not expecting you to do all of that for this exercise here. I just want you to say, we haven't quite worked it all out yet, but we do notice that there's a bunch of, wall lizards that seem to like to congregate on the north side of these built structures, and only the north side. What's that about? So okay, wall lizards. You told me where, like, it'd be nice to have a little location there. It's a novel pattern, interesting pattern that seems potentially, doesn't have to be, but potentially, like, that's the idea. You're testing the hypothesis that there's some anthropogenic involvement that is changing their behavior, or that their behavior is interacting with, that will have downstream effects on population structure, et cetera, et cetera. So all I'm looking for here is, we think it's preliminary, you can change. We think we're going to study this organism that we've know exists in this place, that we think has a potential to interact with humans in this way. That's the big thing that I'm looking for here. Any other questions? Okay. So that is a group assignment. Oh, I think I've managed to get everybody into groups. I think there might be one or two individuals I'm still waiting on. There are a couple of groups at the end there that, due to the number of students in the class, I had to manually kind of assemble and then get everybody on board and make sure everybody was okay with that. I think I've got everybody in groups except for, again, maybe there's like two groups and I'm waiting for one person to confirm. So if you are, if you did get an email for me asking like, hey, are you okay with being in this group? Make sure that you respond to me, or you update your submission, or leave a comment on the submission or something, so that I can finalize those. But assuming that all the groups are finalized, this is a group assignment, so it only needs to be uploaded by one member of the group, and then it immediately will populate for all the other members of the group. And when it gets graded by one member, that grade gets populated for all the members of the group. Okay. All right. So today I want to talk about time. And so I thought, this cicada aggregation was kind of this is sort of a grainy picture, but it got me thinking, as this is a kind of nice way to motivate the types of issues that are of interest to me for today's topic here. So, cicadas, depending on what brood they are, they come out in different periods, but there's a giant number of cicadas come out all at one time. They pepper trees. They, make a cacophony of noise. They're very conspicuous. They are eaten by birds and a bunch of other critters, but they nevertheless emerge and don't seem to care. So, or rather, the reproductive strategy doesn't seem to be affected by the clear predation off these sort of, popcorn that pops out of the earth that is suddenly plentiful and available for a whole bunch of predators that are out there. So why do you think that is? Why does this reproductive strategy persist despite it putting a bunch of prey right in the crosshairs of a whole bunch of predators? Any thoughts on that? Yeah, I saw your hand first. Yeah, so it sounds like, if you didn't hear that, then the hypothesis here is that there's just so many of them that someone in some uh, related member of the cicada family is going to survive and make her way to reproduction. And there will be a large number that are eaten, but there's too many to get eaten for all of them to get eaten. They're just, the predators are just not available. What do you mean by inadvertent population control? Well, so I think it's an interesting question about population control. So I think that it is probably good that cicadas emerge in areas that where predators have access to them. I think that that does, in some ways control how many cicadas are out there. But we always have to be careful when we think about these kind of species level effects, because if you were a cicada that decided whether, like if it was a question of location and you had a choice of location, then the cicadas that are doing things that somehow are good for the ecological community are sort of the suckers in that, because then the cicadas that do go elsewhere where they can sort of do their cicada reproduction thing sheltered away from that, those are the ones that ultimately are going to be able to reproduce faster than the others. So there are these guys in like Wynne Edwards and all that in the early 50s that were interested in potential sort of species level um, uh, population phenomena where things that were sort of maybe good for the species could bubble through. But since then, they find that we haven't found a mechanism that actually allows for that to happen, because there's always a way, always a chink in the armor, a weak spot where an animal that does something that's not good for the species can take advantage, and there's no way that it just can't spread. And so when we talk a little bit about social strategies in the last chapter, we'll talk about chapter 14 and a little bit of 13. Then we'll talk maybe a little bit about that and the subject of altruism. But that's, we have to sort of, usually when we try to think for hypotheses here, we try to think of kind of hypotheses on the level of function to the individual, or even crazier, to the gene. Because a lot of times things that are good for the gene aren't good for the so-called vehicle, the individual. I saw another hand. What? Well, that's what we're trying to figure out. So I mean, the general predominating hypothesis here is that it is this special form of this reproductive strategy where you just dump a huge number of of organisms in an area, counting on the handling time, which we talked about last time, preventing predators from eating all of the cicadas. So this is a case where we talked about in Holling's disk equation last time, that if you have low prey density, if you double the prey density, you'll double the number of prey captured by a predator. But if you get to way up here, it gets to the point where a predator that eats one of these cicadas takes so long to eat it that that's the dominating time that limits the rate of ingestion of the cicadas. And so it just kind of becomes like this levels off here, is sort of saying if all the predator was doing 100% of its time was eating and then moving and eating and then moving and eating, because it takes so long to eat relative to so short it takes to move, then the eating ends up basically putting a ceiling on how much that one predator can eat. And that's just a time ceiling. I mean, not only that, and so this is, by the way, called the predator saturation or swamping or starvation strategy. So it's a reproductive strategy that produces so many offspring that predators cannot consume all of them. And it has a nice little side effect that if predators were to specialize on these cicadas, or whatever other organism uses this strategy, then those predators would probably starve in the intervening time. So having bursty and huge reproduction like this makes it so that you're kind of guaranteed that some cicadas survive to reproduce themselves, and that in between, the predators that are eating the cicadas are going to have to eat something else, and so they're not going to become cicada specialists. So that's kind of what we mean by starvation, or swamping, or saturation. So the saturation kind of relates to this right here. This is being saturated. That's right. There's just so many that even if all the predators in the forest get their fill, there's still going to be some left over. Yeah. Well, that's if a hypothetical predator, like, keep in mind that, like, between every eruption of cicadas, there's no cicadas. So in the 17 years between, 17-year cicada eruptions, if you were a predator, they were the only thing you could eat were cicadas, then you would starve in that 17 years between. So it's plentiful while they're there, but then when they go away, it's a long time until the next ones come. So this is a way of sort of forcing predators that eat you to not specialize on you, and still having enough that the ones that eat you will end up eating others. So it's kind of this kind of almost goes into parental conflict. It's almost like the parents made a family planning decision to just have a huge number of offspring, counting on some of them getting killed and eaten. And that's just the way they decided to make sure that that was the sustainable way to go. Yeah. Well, the idea is that if the predators can't eat all of them, they will eventually die before the predators need another meal. And then when they die, it will be years until the cicadas erupt or emerge again. And so, in that intervening time where there's no cicadas, if a predator depends on cicadas, that predator is not going to do very well. So this strategy it's both a swamping or saturation strategy and a starvation strategy, because when the cicadas are around, there's too many, but when they're not around for too long. So it's a way to sort of ensure that they aren't a reliable food source for any predator that's out there. But a big part of this is limited by the predator's so-called handling time. So handling time here. But the other thing that they're limited by is the gut of the predator. So here we've got, actual cicada there being eaten. Look at the size of that bird. Look at the size of that cicada. Probably can't pop more than 2 or 3 in there before you're full, and it's just impossible to get any more. And then it takes a long time to get those, pushed all the way through and turned into bird poop. So that itself, gut capacity, and this is something we'll talk about next time. if we don't assume that predators have got a finite gut capacity, we get certain predictions. But then when we pop in gut capacity, then those predictions oftentimes flip around and go in different directions. So we not only have to worry about time in the cicada case, but also just it's only possible for a predator to eat so many because the predator is only so big. So that's something we'll talk about next time. But here we're focusing on the time component. All right, so that's kind of just a motivation for this idea of time. So does everybody feel? I don't know questions about this idea of this term, predator saturation or swamping. Make sense? So that's not really a predator strategy, but it is, this is sort of the case where predators can't really control their time. It's like the predator's time investment has been forced by the prey's reproductive strategy. Most of the time, the predator does have some flexibility. Yeah. This has no, I mean, there are relationships to humans because humans are animals, but this is sort of suggested. This is a process by which certain reproductive strategies would evolve over evolutionary history. So it's like there was a cicada um, once upon a time, or a proto cicada that started having very large numbers of offspring, and those cicadas that had very large numbers of offspring tended to be the ones that survived to have more cicadas that have very large number of offspring, and that thing just grew and grew and grew until you have this massive broods that come out, and that ended up dealing with like these cicadas are nice juicy morsel, a lot of protein, right? So this is definitely a target for these predators. Rather than evading the predators, which is what they could do, they just said, well, fine, we're just going to count on bycatch. We're just going to count on predators eating us, and our way to compensate for that is just to have a lot of us. And so that was a reproductive strategy. So it's the evolution of how big your brood size is, and this is something that would drive it. This is this effect here. Okay. Okay. So yeah, normally predators have more control over how they spend their time, but different types of predators have different strategies that affect how they can use that time. And so I talk very briefly about some different types of predation. And so before we get to the one that is sort of the most of what we're going to talk about today, so one of the predators we have is a sit and wait or ambush predator. So this is the case like spiders. This is they wait for prey to arrive. You're going to read, if you haven't already, this article about these burrowing owls, where they sit in their burrows and they modify their burrows to attract prey to it. So here, it's like a reference frame issue. Rather than the predator moving around, the prey come to it. And if they want to reduce the time between prey items, then they have to either set up shop, like so spiders, for example. Spiders are not attracted to light typically, at least not in a way like a moth to a flame. But you often see spiders setting up their spider webs on street lamps, and that largely is following that there's usually aggregations of other things that are attracted to street lamps. And the spiders, the ones that have been successful, have been the ones that ended up putting their webs by street lamps to just catch all that stuff that comes lured in to the street lamp. So when you're a sit and wait predator, the way you can manage the time between prey is by creating lures. And so spiders can do that by maybe putting their webs in places that are more attractive to their prey. These owls, as you'll see in that paper, can do that by maybe lining their nests with material that are more attractive to foods that they eat. So that's the way that sit and wait predators end up sort of, working with. And there's a large number of sit and wait predators. There's frogs, there's little crab spiders that sit in flowers waiting for a pollinator to come by, and then they jump on them. This is a very well used strategy. Even the weaver ant, which is this ant in Australia that Anushka studies, that lives in these huge colonies across many trees. People view them as sort of a large sit and wait predator because rather than the ants having to go, I mean, they do go out and forage, but a large amount of the prey biomass that they bring in is just stuff that lands in the tree and they grab it. So it's almost as if their above ground nests have become almost like this spider web, just without the sticky silk, at least not the sticky silk for catching things. So this is a very sort of successful strategy as a predator, is to be a sit and wait predator. But then you kind of got to deal with the time it takes for something to arrive. And about the only way you can get things to arrive faster is to find some way to lure them there. That's sit and wait or ambush predation. Great. So you can use lures, fine. Then but I think what's more interesting are these active predators. So predators that go out and so move around. So like this little jumping spider guy, that in these cases they either steal prey from others. So that's kleptoparasitism, or klepto meaning steal, parasitism. So they're not eating the thing the host, they're stealing from the host, they're doing forcing a cost on the host, or they go around and they start finding the prey themselves. And so there are different things that active hunters can eat. There's carnivores, so cheetahs and things like that, actively searching for other animals that themselves can move around. This is a very complex search strategy here. You've got to be cryptic. You've got to be able to deal with your prey then darting away from you, and how do you deal with that? There are even some ants that have actually adapted ways to use their communication network to send a large number of ants toward a, say, still mobile grasshopper, because they don't know where the grasshopper is going to jump. And so they need to have ants in different spots where the grasshopper could land. So they need to sort of catch the grasshopper. So there are special adaptations in dealing with mobile prey that we're not going to get into here, but I just mentioned it there. Saprophagy or saprophages, these are things that feed on dead or decaying material, like carrion birds. And then it's kind of like herbivory, similar idea. You're feeding on something that's in the same place. So the big question for these two things relating to time is, how long do you spend there? So how long do you eat at one area before moving on? And how long do you eat, how long do you eat a plant? There might not be the whole plant that you're eating. There might be just like a couple berries in the plant. Those berries are easy to find initially, harder to find later. How long do you stay there? And those are sort of the key questions that we're kind of focusing on here. Something that I guess I point out here is that these active predators, generally, they are limited by prey availability. So they do have a handling time that's important, but usually an active predator doesn't just trip over prey. They have to go and find prey. So if there is an increase in prey, you see a great increase in predator productivity. And that's just, if it wasn't that way, then they would be ambush predators. So if you happen to be a predator that can set up a little niche there where you get a lot of your prey just comes to you, then that's great. And so you probably, as long as you choose a good spot, you're fine. Here, if you actually have to move around, then it's probably really important to move around in a smart way. And that is kind of what motivates, the rest of this lecture, is like, what do animals do to sort of make their movements the most efficient? Okay. So along with that is that not only do you have to move around to find prey, there are some animals like this red-winged blackbird that after they find prey, they have to bring it home. And so that sets up a whole new set of decision making. Is it worth me picking up this really heavy thing that I'm going to have to fly way back home to deposit, using up a huge amount of energy to the point where I might have to go out later anyway, just to refill the energy that I used up to bring this thing home? So a central place forager might find a really juicy item, but if that juicy item requires so much energy to bring home, they might have to leave it there because ultimately they're bringing it home to feed, for example, chicks in the nest. So, central place foraging, the idea that you have to bring food home, enhances the handling time. So now you're not only limited by handling time, but you're also limited by time to return home. So there are a bunch of models of central place foraging that look like models of sort of normal foraging, but they sort of bend off much quicker because the handling time is so much more salient, because you have to include not only how long to eat it, but all of that extra time just schlepping it around. So that's why it's important to know: are you a central place forager, or can you just eat where you find it? Okay, so these are just kind of the terms before we get into the models and the predictions. So any questions about any of this stuff? Just laying out some of the terminology. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great example. So an anglerfish, these are these fish that have this bioluminescent lure that they hang out in front of them, and they just sit and wait for something to come to the lure, very much like the spiders that set up webs by lights, and things that are attracted to the lights, then they pop out and get. So yes, an anglerfish does not have to go searching for its food. It just needs to set up shop, turn on its light, and wait. Yep. That's an interesting point. How much can we have? I definitely think some of the things that we talk about when we talk about what shapes behavior uh, will are interesting to ask those questions about, say, carnivorous plants. Carnivorous plants definitely are kind of sit and wait predators. They do have to set up shop in an area where they have things that fly in. And they are interesting mutualisms that form. That, for example, there are ants that can dive into pitcher plants and swim in the digestive acids and actually can climb out of the pitcher plants. And so there are some ants that can actually clean up detritus that forms in a pitcher plant. There are also these cute little pitcher plants. You can look them up. I forget their name right now, but they look like toilets. So, and they form at the bottom of the ground, and they actually have a leaf that comes up that looks like a toilet seat. And when it rains, the leaf kind of wilts over and it closes it like a lid of a toilet seat. I crap you not. And they're little rodents that will sit like so. It excretes these secretions on the outside of this little pitcher plant, and little rodents go and lick these secretions, and while they're licking, they literally sit on the pot and they drop their nitrogen rich frass or scat into this pitcher plant, and that's how the pitcher plant gets these nutrients. It lives on the feces of these animals. And so there's these really sort of interesting ways that you could say, well, is that, I wouldn't call it sit and wait predation, but it is, they are trying to attract attention. And I definitely think the type of thinking that we're doing about these animals can be applied to the plants. But when we have to keep in mind that the plants have a very different life history, and so we might need a new framework to think about plant behavior, but we can stretch the animal behavior frameworks, I think, a large way to ask interesting questions. Yeah. So sea stars have little feet, and they're slow, but they do move around. And they kind of bring things up through them, and they kind of chew on things as they go. And so um, I would say that their predation strategy is not shaped by special adaptations for them to sit. I would say a sit and wait predator, an ambush predator, is one that has a special adaptation that makes it really good at just waiting for things to come to it and snapping them, and then grabbing them. Usually fast, they're usually cryptic. They sort of hide. They usually have ways of detecting that something's arrived and then very quickly acting on it. Whereas a sea star, although it's slow, it still is very kind of active to me. Like if you watch them at time lapse, they move around quite a lot. Or if you hold them in your hand, like the little tube feet that tickle your hand. Okay, so yeah. Now let's start here. So we'll do a little flicker. Multiple choice. All right, what type of predator are scavenger carrion birds like vultures? What category do they fit in? Are they saprophages? What do they fit best in? So, what's the narrowest category that they fit into? Saprophages, carnivores, herbivores, or ambush predators? So, if we're talking about a bird that waits for an animal to die and then goes and it eats the flesh of that dead animal, then which category does that fit into? So give you a second there, just kind of a pure definitional question. And maybe I'll leave that up for a bit so we can move on. All right, so that's just kind of the predation 101, a bunch of different strategies. I'm skipping over some other options, but what I really want to focus on here is, let's say you're an active predator, but you're one of these ones that you're looking for immobile prey. So you're looking for dead things, or you're looking for plants. And really the key question is not how well do you need to be hidden so that your prey doesn't see you, how fast do you need to run, those sorts of things. It's really how long do you stay in a patch? So you've got this bee, for example, and it's looking for good stuff. This is what we mean. I'm going to define a patch in a second. This is what I mean by a patch. That bee can stay there for a long period of time or a short period of time. It can search all throughout it, and it at some point leaves and goes to another one of those. So that's what we mean by a patch, is in sort of a heterogeneous environment where you're going to have some areas that have high reward, that have high caloric gain. There's nectar, there's pollen, etc. And then some areas that are just empty. And so you then move from area to area to area, and you have to decide, do I stop at one of these areas? And then once I've stopped there, how long do I spend at that area? And so we are now, diving into these frameworks that have been very successful at predicting, based on changes in the environment, how long do how do animals change, how long they spend at these different patches. So these are patches. Next time we'll talk about prey. Patches, heterogeneous, where the question is not whether to eat it, it's how long to stay there. Question. Yeah, right. So you can think of this as, I just sort of spread these out, is the bee spends 5 minutes here, it goes searching, spends 3 minutes here, it goes searching, spends 2 minutes here, it goes searching, spends another 5 minutes here. So the question is, how do I explain the average time the bee spends in patches of the same type? And can I relate changes in that time to changes in the environment? So, for example, if I were to put all of these patches closer together, would I predict the bee change how much she spends in each one of these? What do you guys think? If I were to put these flowers closer together, do you think a bee should spend longer time or shorter time in the flowers? How many people think the bee should spend longer in flowers if you put the flowers closer together? Okay, so I'd say 30%. How many people think that if you put the flowers closer together, the bee should spend? I said longer, right? So shorter. How many people say shorter? So it looks like more short there. How many people say longer? Couple of longer. I mean, okay. So the shorter. Somebody said shorter. What was your rationale for shorter? Why would a bee spend less time? Yeah. Yeah, so it sounds like you're saying, if we were to use those terms from last time, opportunity cost, when these are close together, there's a really high opportunity cost of staying on the flower, because if it's not really providing you a lot of benefit, then it's so easy to just go to another one. So it's a waste of time to stay here. Um, Yeah, so that's kind of the shorter logic, I think. Does anybody have a longer logic for why they might think longer? Yeah. So that's another interesting hypothesis, is that maybe that there's a decrease, that because it's less costly to go from flower to flower, that maybe they're kind of going to know that there's going to be more fuel in the tank, so they can spend more time here. And I think both of those explanations are perfectly reasonable. I think one of them is motivated by opportunity missed. The other one is motivated by resources. So if I have a finite amount of resources to move myself around, then I think it makes sense. That prediction, I think, makes sense. If I am not resource limited, but I want to make sure over a long time period I'm very productive, then I think the other explanation makes sense. When I was presenting the quail work, there was an excellent question in the back about, well, and the quail speed up, don't they use up more energy? Couldn't that potentially be a cost to speeding up, even though they're encountering all that? And for the quail, their body, they can speed up and slow down without too much extra. But for a giant cheetah, then absolutely, I think that choosing to run at your top speed is going to burn a huge amount of energy, much more energy than only using your top speed when you absolutely need it. So ecological conditions definitely can drive all this, and we have to make assumptions and see what camp we're in. So we're going to focus here, assuming that the bee is not energy limited in the short term. So let's see what that might provide us. And so, assuming the bee is not energy limited, then what we model here is the time in the patch is on this x-axis, and the average gain. This isn't rate of gain, it is calories. It is the for if you spend a minute in the patch, on average. So by average, I mean you could spend a minute in this patch, a minute in that patch, a minute in that patch. They're all the same flower type. So on average, across flowers of this type, if you spend a minute in them, you're going to get an average of 30 calories out. And if you spend 2 minutes in them, you might get an average of 40 calories out. The key thing here is that we're assuming that these flowers have what's known as diminishing marginal returns, which means that the longer you stay, then the less additional calories you'll get. What motivates this? Well, it's this idea that when you originally arrive, let's say you arrive to a bush and it's full of berries. Well, then you just eat the berries and you can very quickly accumulate lots of calories. But over time, it becomes harder to find more berries because you picked all the easy to find ones. So now you got to search for them. And eventually you might deplete all of the berries. So if this rounds off and it flattens out up top here, then that means you might have eaten everything in that patch and there's nothing more that you can get. So you're just stuck at that top. So if you look at these two options, it kind of makes it seem like you should probably stay for, definitely for this period where it rises quickly, but you probably shouldn't stay for this long where things level off. Because at some point in the middle, it will be better use of your time to search for a new flower where you can enter down here than it is to keep exploiting this flower up here. People are now seeing this, like with electric charging of vehicles and things like that. They'd say, how long, this a battery charges like this. And so people used to driving gas cars just fill up the tank, and that doesn't take that long. But in an electric vehicle, the first 30 minutes give you a huge amount of charge, but then the next 30 minutes don't increase your battery that much. So then you have to balance these things. It's this patch leaving rule. How long do I stay at this patch? Given that I'm not fully charged, but if I keep driving down the road, then the next time I hit a charger, I can make sure that I always charge in this region. Now that puts you close to, to maybe running out of fuel, but it ensures that you don't have to waste a whole lot of time, spending hours just trying to get that last percent. And that's the same thing that's going on with this B at this patch here. So that's our setup, that we're imagining here that there is some giving up time that's optimal, that somewhere in the middle, and we want to try to be able to predict where is this optimal time to leave the patch, and how might it depend on environmental parameters that we can measure so that we can make predictions in experiments. So any questions about this setup? Okay. All right. So let's think about how to do this. Now, what I'm going to show you a little tiny bit of math here, and there will be the mention of calculus. I'm not expecting you to be able to derive any of this. The result is the important thing. But for those of you interested in where the result comes from, I provide these couple of lines. Don't freak out. I'm not going to ask you to do any of this on an exam. It's not a math class. It's not a modeling class. It's about this key result that comes out. And that result you really need to know, because it's like a fundamental result in animal behavior. All right, so we've seen this before, Holling's disk equation. So as a review, this D is sort of the density of prey items. The A is kind of like the rate at which you encounter any one prey item. And so, or in other words, based on the geometry and conspicuousness of any one prey item, if you were to walk around randomly, how long until you'd bump into it? And then if you do 1 over that, that gives you this rate right here, this A rate there. And then H is the handling time. How long does it take for you to process that prey item once you found it? Now, you can do a little manipulation here, and you can say, I'm just going to divide the numerator and denominator by this AD thing, and that separates out my handling time and this ugly 1 over AD. Well, if you think about the 1 over AD thing, that's just a time. That's just the average time in between finding anything. So I'm just going to replace that with something I'm calling S. So now I've turned Holling's disk equation into this really simple 1 over S plus H. H is the handling time, how long it takes to touch the disk. S is the average search time between the disks, which internally depends on the density and whatever, but we're assuming that that's fixed. And so for an environment, there is an S, and for a prey type, there is an H. What was what? A and D. So A is the rate at which you encounter a single prey item. D is effectively the number of prey items in the environment. So when you combine them together, A times D is the rate at which you encounter any prey item, not a specific prey item. Pardon me? Yeah, the rate of encountering an individual prey item. In reality, the most important thing here is not A and D separately. That was important for the last lecture. You can think of these as one parameter called AD. And AD is the rate in encounters per second that you encounter prey. So that's the theoretical rate if it wasn't for your handling time. So if you had 0 handling time, you would encounter prey at AD rate. But because every time you encounter a prey item, you have to process it, then that slows you down. So your actual encounter rate is this thing. So don't worry about the A and the D, just think of it as AD. And that this 1 over AD, that is the average time in between encounters. Are we okay with that? All right, so where do we go from there? Well, I want to relate this to this thing. So I'm going to say, well, I don't just want to count the number of encounters. I want to know how many calories do I get per encounter. Well, I've got this nice function here that says if I spend this much time in a patch, handling the patch, I get this average amount of calories out of the patch. So I'm just going to remove that 1 and replace it with this thing. So now my rate of gain, so this isn't how often I encounter patches, this is how many calories I generate by foraging as I'm just running through the environment. So this is calories per time. This is like in units of, this is kind of like units of watts, it's like joules per second. So this is how much energy, how much power I'm getting from running around my environment. And so H is, again, now I'm going to call it the patch residence time. G of H is how much average calories I get out of every patch. And S is the average time it takes to move from patch to patch. Everybody okay with that? It's just Holling's disk equation reformulated for the patch problem. All right, so here's where it gets a little um, uh, more. If you remember that, from high school calculus, that if you want to maximize a function, you take its derivative relative to the thing that you want to maximize over, and you set that equal to 0. So this is what I don't need you to know how to do. But for those of you who want to know where this fancy rule that comes from, I'm putting it here. And this is it. This is all the calculus math that's here, is that you take this thing, you take the derivative of this reward rate relative to how long you spend in every patch, and it's a ratio, so you use the quotient rule. And so if you remember the quotient rule, you get this thing that's out of it. And if you set this thing equal to 0, the denominator goes away, and you effectively solving the numerator to be equal to 0, and you get this down here, this magical formula that we're going to call the marginal value theorem on the next slide. All right, so for those that are interested, that's where it comes from, but this is the net result. This suggests that the best thing you can do as a predator is to choose your handling time such that this is the case. The thing on the left here, that's the instantaneous rate that you're getting from the current patch. The thing on the right is the long-term rate you're getting from the whole environment. So to put that in words, the marginal value theorem says stay in the patch until the instantaneous rate you're getting from the patch drops to the overall average rate you're getting from the background environment. This is an opportunity cost calculation. This is basically saying that the amount of energy you're getting by your foraging strategy represents the opportunity cost of your time. You know that if you're an optimal forager, this is how much you need to get at a minimum for it to be worth your time to be there. The thing over here, this instantaneous reward, this is how much energy per unit time you're getting from your current activity. So this is saying that so long as the benefit rate you're getting from your current activity is greater than the opportunity cost, keep doing it. At the instant the rate of gain from your current activity hits the opportunity cost, it's better to be doing something else. So go do something else. And the beauty of this little marginal value theorem is it has this nice, convenient graphical explanation. So I can take this blue line, that is the rate of gain in an individual patch. And this is for the single patch model here. And if I look down here and I think about what this means geometrically, then this says that if I just draw an axis out the back here and I put a dot that is separated from the origin by the search time, and then I connect a tangent line from that dot to the point of tangency with this curve, that point where they intersect, that's the solution to this equation. And if you think about it, like, the slope of this line, what is it? It's the rise, which is G over H, over the run, which is H plus S. Well, that's that right there, G, H over S plus H, where I've made this H star to be this specific H right here. So, and then if you think about it, what's the definition of a derivative? Well, the derivative is the slope at a point. Well, that point of tangency, that's the slope of this blue curve. So having this graphical interpretation means that without doing any of the math, I can predict what's going to happen if I move my flowers closer together or farther apart. If I move them farther apart, that point of tangency moves to the right. I spend more time in each patch. If I move them closer together, that point of tangency moves in and I spend less time. And so it's this cool graphical model that I have an easy time in my head using that solves this complex equation that I have a harder time, working in my head, but I know that these two match. So any questions about that? This is the marginal value theorem and the solution for when you only have one type of patch. Does that make sense? A natural question is, well, what do I do when I have multiple types of patches? I have a patch of blueberries, a patch of blackberries. I have a dead, cow. All of these different things that give me different returns. How long do I spend in them? And the same basic idea holds is that for each one of those opportunities, you look at how many calories am I getting per unit time at that instant. So I stayed here a second. How many calories did I get in the last second? I can figure out a rate of caloric increase. And you don't have to be doing the calculations in your head. Your blood sugar is rising at this rate, basically. So there are physiological mechanisms inside you that, when you get hungry or hangry and you eat something and very quickly you feel better, that is a physiological mechanism implementing this rate of change right here. So there are ways in which your body can already do this. And if there are cues somehow, density. So there could be visual cues that once I see that there's not enough red versus green in this bush of red berries, then that is a cue that I can use that it's time to leave there. So there's all sorts of different proximate mechanisms that can implement this. This is an ultimate, this is dealing with a explanation at the level of function. It's answering the question of why do bees spend less time in some situations and more time at others. It's not answering how they know that they should spend less time or more time. That's another very interesting question, but that is separate from this question. So don't think the bee has to do calculus in order to do this. That is not what's being implied here. So whatever you're doing, look at the instantaneous return, and then you know what you're getting from the environment. You're saying, today, I've gotten so many calories over the whole day. Well, that so many calories over the whole day, that gives you a background expectation of how rich the environment is. If the environment becomes richer, you leave sooner. If the environment becomes poorer, you stay in there longer. Conservation biologists for a long time, they started to try to keep animals from crossing the road very frequently. And before thinking through it with this, they started enriching the sides of roads, thinking that enriching the sides of roads with really good forage would be a way to sort of be a barrier of keeping animals on that side of the road. But they enriched both sides of the roads. So does anybody have any guess as to what happened? Yeah, in the back. They cross, and how often do they cross? Often, basically, yeah, yeah. They're like, this now armadillo or whatever is like, whoa, this is like, this bush is awesome, but all of the bushes are awesome. And once this bush stops being a little bit awesome, or stops being awesome by just a little bit, I know I can just go to another bush and it's going to be even better. So I'm just going to keep walking across the road. Oh, this bush is great. I'm going to leave. So interestingly enough, to keep animals in a patch, if that is your strategy for controlling the crossing of the roads, I'm not saying this is a good strategy, but if that is your strategy, the way you do it is actually making the patches poorer or putting them far more distance between them, because then that will encourage the animals to stay in the patches rather than trying to search. So that's the marginal value theory. All right, questions about that? Does that make clear? You enter a patch, the rewards are hot, the marginal values drop, eventually they hit a point, and so some patches you're going to stay longer in than others, but all of them you're going to leave at roughly the same time. That's the prediction. If you then in a laboratory spread things out or put things together, you should get predictable changes in the end. It turns out that's exactly what happens. In a lab, you can put little conveyor belts in front of birds, and as food goes by, and watch how they respond to that. So you can adjust how often they encounter things, and by adjusting it, you get predictions that match these expressions. All right, questions on that? Does that make sense? Marginal value theorem. It's effectively an economic principle. It is identical to some of the equimarginal principles you might learn in microeconomics, consumer choice theory, and so on. They match perfectly, but instead of dollars and cents, it's calories and time. Okay, cool. Now, what's also cool about it is that people started to think about other problems in animal behavior that had the same structure. And that, one of the examples of this is the so-called optimal diving models, which are also foraging models. So you got a big, diving mammal like this one that spends some time underwater. Now, as fellow mammals, it's hard to spend a lot of time underwater because you got to breathe. So there is a balance between how much time you spend on the surface, filling your lungs, and how much time you go underwater. And so the question is, what does the optimal forager do? How long does the optimal forager stay on top and stay under? And so if you think about it, this oxygen intake curve is a lot like the curve that we just saw for being in a patch. The time at surface as you increase, if your lungs are empty, they very quickly fill. But then over time, your lungs get stuck and you just can't pack in a whole lot more air. And so then it rounds off. So it's probably good that if your lungs are empty, you probably shouldn't go right back under. You should probably take a couple of really deep breaths of air. But at some point, the time it takes for you to fill your lungs 100% is going to be lost opportunity for going down and eating the krill or whatever it is down at depth. So people realized that you could use the same models to try to predict what a number of different mammals were doing at the surface. And they formed, this is an example I took out of a paper, an early paper on this by Houston and Carbone. And this looks a lot, this is a screen capture out of their picture, but it looks a lot like exactly the marginal value theorem picture that I showed you, but it's been modified slightly. So they have over here, this is the time between patches. So there's a bunch of krill or something underneath me. There's a bunch of krill over there, whatever. In order for me to move from there to there, I need to expend a certain amount of energy, which means I need a certain amount of oxygen in my lungs. So here, this is the oxygen needed to move between patches. So what that means is when I land at this patch over here, I may not, if I don't spend enough time at the surface, I'm not going to have any oxygen left to go down. So I need to then decide how much time to spend at the surface. And as I spend time at the surface and breathe in, then my lungs fill, but eventually it rounds off here. So this is the optimal time at the surface, and it is exactly at that point. So you learn that marginal value theorem graph, and there's a bunch of other problems that you can solve graphically, maybe with a slight modification where you start off at kind of at a negative because it took oxygen to get where you were. But then that makes a nice prediction about how, as animals have to move around, how might that change the time they spend at the surface? And what's hidden in here is also the time they spend underwater, because you make the assumption that they're going to spend as much time as they can underwater, which is limited by the amount of oxygen. So as other people do, they change this plot where they basically can convert oxygen stores into equivalent amount of time underwater. So you have time underwater on this axis and time at the surface on this axis, but you make the predictions using the marginal value theorem. So it's a foraging problem, but it's not quite the same foraging problem, but it's solved in the same way. Any questions about that? Optimal diving. It's kind of a fun example. It's not the only example. There's also, and I'm not going to go into details here, famous examples in oviposition. You're a female insect, female hymenopteron. You're going around. You need to lay some eggs. How many eggs do you lay here? How many eggs do you lay there? How long do you spend laying eggs? That's all also been modeled using the marginal value theorem. That's not quite a foraging problem, but it has exactly the same structure. And it has been very successful at predicting the behavior of these insects. All right, so that, in the remaining time I have left, I want to give one other quick example about time limits, interestingly enough, is that I hope you remember that the MVT is all about average gain. But we know that some patches are going to have more gain than others. So variation matters. And so then the question is, what do animals do when they have a patch that has the same average gain, but is more variable, a patch type that's the same average gain as another patch type, but this one's always 5 calories, this one's sometimes 0 and sometimes 10. How does an animal decide? And it turns out that plenty of animals do. Juncos, other birds are able to tell the difference between these two, and under different conditions, sometimes they choose the consistent rewards, sometimes they choose the variable rewards. So if you, for example, let this bird feed and then starve it for an hour, then give it the choice of a feeder that's always 5 or a feeder that's sometimes 0 and sometimes 10, then this bird consistently will choose 5. But if you then starve her for an additional 3 hours, she will consistently choose the variable feeder. So a starved bird seeks out variation. A satiated bird, seeks out consistency. And so the logic here that we'll show here in just a second is that if you're already above your survival limits, like there are birds that if they don't get enough calories, they won't survive the night. So if you need a certain amount of calories by the time by the end of the night, and you're not even close to that, then a chance at 10 might be better than a certain 5, because a certain 5 might be certain death. So this is what we refer to as a stretch goal. So if I want to kind of show that graphically, then I've got this sort of rewards here. And so I've got a survival threshold. So by the end of the night, I have to reach the yellow bar. I've got a fixed reward of 5 that's currently above the bar, or a variable reward that's 0 or 10. The 0 is below the bar. Well, in this case, I know that the fixed reward, I'm going to survive. So why take the risk? Just go for the fixed reward. But that's why the constant reward makes sense. But in this other case, where if my survival threshold, based on my current energy state, if 5 isn't going to push me over it, sure, 0 won't either, but 10 will. So in this case, I at least have some chance of survival by choosing the variable rewards. And that's known as a stretch goal. So when animals are down on their luck, when it looks like the average behavior isn't going to make it, many animals switch to highly variable behaviors because at least there's a chance at that point. So that's kind of what we're saying here. I can say that a little bit more graphically to say that when you're facing a reward distribution that looks like this, then in these cases, you want to maximize the variance of that distribution because the mean just won't cut it. But if you're looking at reward distributions like this, then you want to minimize the variance because you don't want any chance of this happening over here. And interestingly enough, you can bet hedge in order to do that. So bet hedging is the idea that you can give up on your mean rewards in order to make your rewards more certain. So that's what I mean by hedging bets, is that we, even though most likely we would have gotten a better reward from the fatter distribution, we're worried about this small chance of this happening. And so instead, we're going to pay down our risk. We're going to give up on some of this mean. This is kind of like buying your postage stamps ahead of time, even when you don't need them. That pays down the uncertainty of their price going up later. And that's what we refer to as bet hedging, which is driven by thresholds and time constraints. So yet another effect of time. And with that, we're out of time, but that's all I have for you. So don't worry, you will survive. Those are your reminders. So let's do a closing. All right. And so the short answer that I'm looking for is in the MVT. What does the M stand for? So what word is the M in MVT? So that big famous rule that's super important that I want you to remember, MVT, what does the M stand for? And it is not mean. And that's all I've got for you. So we'll see you on Thursday for diet choice.